Well, in this passage, once again, Jesus and the Pharisees are at it again. If you read the Gospels, you know that the Pharisees and Jesus, they never quite seem eye to eye. And here we are in convention season with the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention just a few days away. Kind of like Jesus and the Pharisees. I won't say which is which. Just never quite seem to see eye to eye. In this case, it's an argument over rules about hand washing. And we can see that the first verse tells us that the Pharisees were asking questions. Why don't your disciples obey what our ancestors taught us to do about washing hands in a specific way before you eat? This is a tradition, this is a rule, and the Pharisees are wondering why the disciples, Jesus' disciples, aren't following it. And Jesus replies, "It's useless for me to worship," excuse me, this is a quote from Isaiah. He said, "It is useless for you to worship me when you teach rules made up by humans." So all of a sudden, there's an argument over rules. Now, we have some students who go to school during the day. Raise your hand if there are rules in your classroom. Yeah. Anybody want to volunteer to say one of the rules that's in their classroom that their teacher gives them? Yeah, what do you got? No flipping desks over. Nikki, I can always count on you for a good response. And Lily, what about you? Any rules? No calling out without raising your hand. Sure. No food or drinks in the classroom. That's a good one. So, the question is about rules. And in this case, the Pharisees are saying, why don't you obey these rules? And Jesus is saying, well, look, you're following rules made up by humans. And it's almost like Jesus says, I don't care about rules. This makes it a pretty popular passage for folks to look at because a lot of times we don't like rules or we don't like the idea of rules. And so having Jesus kind of stand up there and point at the Pharisees and say, you're all consumed with rules, but rules are made to be broken. And I'm Jesus and me and my disciples are going to do whatever we want and we can forget about your rules because rules are made to be broken. And say you end up with this analysis of this passage which says that the Pharisees were consumed by rules and legalism, and Jesus was there to set us free from rules, and that's just a wonderful thing. That analysis, which is often attached to this passage, is a little bit too simplistic. And I want to suggest to you that Jesus did care about rules. He just had a different way of looking at them. The first thing to say is that Jesus followed a lot of rules. Jesus was raised in traditional Judaism where he grew up in Galilee, and he and all the people around him would have kept the rules of the Torah. Nowhere in this passage does Jesus say that he himself does not keep the dietary rules. We can be sure that Jesus would have kept kosher, as we say today. He would not have eaten unclean foods. So Jesus followed a lot of rules, especially the rules that came from the Torah. Let's look at the next slide. The other thing to say about rules is that we have lots of rules too. We have rules at school, like you mentioned. We even have rules in our families. Now, if you don't think you have rules in your families, you can go ahead and swap the word rule for a word called tradition. Traditions and rules are actually pretty much the same thing. And I actually heard a funny quote from the son of Dr. Phil. And he said, growing up, we had all these family traditions. My dad, Dr. Phil, had all these family traditions. And it wasn't until I got older that I realized that all of them were just rules, but we call them traditions. A lot of times we have traditions about how we eat at families. Maybe you have a tradition that you wait to start eating until everybody has sat down. Maybe there's a certain night of the week that you make sure that everybody is at the table to have dinner together. Maybe you have traditions about people setting the table and people clearing the table. Maybe you even have traditions about where people sit at the table. These are all kind of rules that help give order to our lives and a sense of belonging. That's the third point that I want to make about rules. Rules are not all that bad because rules help us feel like we're part of something. Let me give you an example of some very special traditions and rules in our country. If you ever go to a sporting event, baseball game, football game, basketball game, especially a baseball game, before a single pitch is thrown, everybody stands up and does what? We say the national anthem. We sing the national anthem, take off our hats. That's a rule that you take off your hat. We say the national anthem. During the 7th inning stretch, it's a rule that we sing another song. Take me out to the ball game. And, if you go to a baseball game for the first time, you might kind of not recognize these rules and traditions, but after a few times, it kind of becomes a part of you. And I don't know about you, but it just sort of fills me up when I'm in a stadium full of people all singing the national anthem together. You feel like you belong to something that's bigger than you, and that's exactly what rules can do. Traditions, like the Pharisees and the Jews growing up in that area, they had a lot of rules and traditions because they were surrounded by people very different from them, and they were oppressed by the Romans. And so they had to have these rules which kept their identity together so that they could know who they are. I want to give another example of a time when I didn't know the rules and then I had to learn them. My next slide, I've got a picture of a symphony orchestra. Now, some of you may have been to a Kravitz Center or someplace where they've got a symphony orchestra. Maybe at a school you saw a symphony orchestra. And a symphony is made up of 4 parts. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, and Part 4. And the idea is that after all 4 parts, everybody claps and maybe even stands up and claps. Well, I didn't know that you weren't supposed to clap after Part 1 and after Part 2 and after Part 3. So Part 1 finished, and I was like, yeah, that was great. And then I turned and looked and saw that nobody else was clapping. And I had to learn the tradition or the rule of going to a symphony orchestra is that you're supposed to wait until the whole symphony is done before you clap. It's just a little simple rule, a little simple tradition. Not knowing it made me feel like I was not part of the audience. And then the next time, of course, that I went and I didn't clap, I felt like I was part of the team. I was part of the audience. And then the third time that I went and I noticed some other people making the mistake and not clapping, I kind of turned up my nose and said, oh, look at those rookies. So that actually illustrates a kind of darker side of rules, though, doesn't it? That when we know the rules and we know the traditions, sometimes we can become prideful and look down on those who don't know the rules or don't know the traditions. So rules have wonderful benefits, traditions have wonderful benefits, but every once in a while they can get us into trouble with our pride. So let's look at the way Jesus would address this whole idea of rules and traditions. Jesus says, the bad words that come out of your mouth are what make you unclean. And what comes out of your heart is what makes you unclean. The prideful thoughts that I was having at the symphony orchestra, no matter how many rules I was following, I still had to deal with that pride inside me that was leading me in tricky directions. And so Jesus, wants the Pharisees to know, no matter how many rules that you follow, you've still got to deal with the dark side of human nature. You still got to deal with the things that come out of your heart and come out of your mouth. So rules or no rules, we still need to deal with our hearts and our mouths. That's good advice. And Jesus is sort of trying to put the idea of rules in their proper spot. Now, Jesus knew something else. This is probably the second thing that he would say about rules. He would say that not everybody can follow the same traditions. This was big because Jesus was in a context where people were pretty much the same. They were all kind of Jews living in this one area, but very quickly, Christianity would spread to vastly different regions. Within 100 years of Jesus dying, there were Christians in Spain, there were Christians in North Africa, there were even Christians maybe in India. And Jesus knew that this Christianity was not going to be a local movement and that Christians would follow all sorts of different traditions along the way. Hey, look, for example, we're at an Episcopal church. The way we set up the altar, the way we do communion, the way we sit and stand and sing and pray is different than another church you might go to. Different traditions, different rules. It's one of the reasons we need to be super welcoming as a congregation so that we can help newcomers along the way. I think what Jesus would say is that not every person can follow the same traditions, the same rules, especially when Christianity gets really big. And of course, that was his plan all along. So is there something that could hold us together Is there something that could bind us together in the same way that we feel bound together when we sing the national anthem at a baseball game? Is there something that could bind Christians together that's stronger and deeper and bigger than a set of rules or traditions? And Jesus says, yes, absolutely. It's called love. We know that at the end of the Gospel of John, Jesus says to his disciples, here's my new commandment. The new commandment that I add to all the other commandments, the new commandment through which you need to read all the other commandments, love one another as I have loved you. This, Jesus says, goes before any rule or tradition that we might want to follow. And so it's not that rules or traditions are bad. It's just that love is so much better. And when you've got love and you're on a journey toward love and you're allowing Jesus to transform your heart and your lips and your life into the kind of loving heart, lips, and life that he desires for us, well, then these rules and traditions, they just start falling into place because they are feeding us and sustaining us and nurturing us as we are transformed into the image of Christ. You see how it works? It's not that rules are bad, it's just that love is better. And if we can interpret and understand the rules through love, well, then we're going to be in great shape, and we get to keep the rules and the traditions all along. I want to tell you a story that I came across the other day, and I've got a picture to kind of illustrate it. The scene takes place in a train station in 1953. And the reason it was in a train station is that there was a very famous person coming into Chicago in 1953. His name was Albert Schweitzer, and he was the Nobel Peace Prize winner. The Nobel Peace Prize, some of you have probably heard about that. It's one of the most impressive awards that anybody can get in their whole life. And Albert Schweitzer had won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he was coming to Chicago to speak to them. And there were reporters, and there was the mayor, and there were the city council members, all at the train station, waiting outside the train to greet Albert Schweitzer as he came off so that they could shake his hand and get a word or two. Well, all 6'4" of him comes off the train, and people are clapping, reporters are moving up to him, the mayor goes to shake his hand, and he seems to look over the crowd and walks right past the mayor, right past the reporters, right past the city council members, and goes up to an elderly woman who was struggling with her suitcase. And Albert Schweitzer picked up the suitcase, smiled at her, and escorted her to the bus that she was trying to get to. At which point he returned to the crowd, returned to the reporters, returned to the mayor, and said, "Sorry to have kept you waiting." The story goes that the mayor turned to one of the reporters and said, "Put this down. This is the first time that I have seen a walking sermon." Albert Schweitzer was one of the great theologians of his time. He was one of the great missionaries of his time. At that time, he was one of the most famous Christians in the entire world. But at that moment, it wasn't about what he had written. It wasn't about the traditions that he followed. It wasn't about the rules that he followed. It wasn't about all of his writings and doctoral theses. It was about an action of love, helping a woman with her bag to the bus. And that was his walking sermon. So what's our challenge? Our challenge is to take love as number one. Our last slide here brings it all together. Let's start with love. Let's invite Jesus to help make our hearts and our mouths and our lives more and more conformed toward love. And then allow the rules and traditions, these wonderful rules, these wonderful traditions that bind us together, allow them to be interpreted through love. Allow them to help us on our journey toward love as we're increasingly becoming these kind of Christians who will be known by our love. There's an old song. There's an old, not quite a hymn, but it goes like this. And they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love. But it doesn't say, and they'll know we are Christians by our rules, by our rules. No, it says, and they'll know we are Christians by our love. Let me close with this. It's a blessing that I heard in a church one time. Life is short, and we don't have a lot of time to gladden the hearts of those who travel with us. So be quick to love, make haste to be kind, and the blessing of God be with you. Amen.